Headlines this year promised scientists had finally cracked open Queen Elizabeth I's DNA and found something inside her body too strange to believe. No laboratory has actually done that. Her tomb in Westminster Abbey has never been opened for genetic testing. No peer-reviewed study has ever sequenced her genome, and the viral videos claiming otherwise trace back to AI. Generated content farms recycling the same fabricated premise across dozens of near-identical uploads, some claiming a hidden royal secret the court supposedly tried to hide, others promising shocking DNA markers that contradict the official Tudor bloodline entirely. Every version tells essentially the same invented story with slightly different dramatic packaging. Not one of them has ever named an actual laboratory, an actual published study, or a single credentialed geneticist who conducted this supposed research. But strip away the invented science, and the real, thoroughly documented story of what actually happened to Elizabeth's body during her 69 years alive is still strange enough to earn the headlines honestly. Start with the tomb itself, because this is where the entire fabricated premise falls apart immediately under scrutiny. Elizabeth was buried in Westminster Abbey on April 28, 1603. Initially placed in the vault belonging to her grandparents, King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, before her successor, King James I, had her moved in 1607 to make room for relocating his own mother, Mary Queen of Scots, into the original vault instead. Elizabeth now rests directly above her half-sister Mary I, inside a shared vault beneath a marble monument in the Abbey's Lady Chapel, a resting place that has remained sealed and undisturbed for over 4 centuries, with the singular exception of a formal Victorian-era survey conducted in the 1870s by Arthur Stanley, who was granted permission by Queen Victoria to examine the royal tombs without ever opening the coffins themselves. Read that again, slowly. The single documented instance of anyone examining Elizabeth's actual burial vault in modern history involved observing the exterior of her lead-lined coffin from a respectful distance, noting its carved Tudor rose engraved, initials, and red silk covering that Stanley recorded as still clinging to the wood after nearly 3 centuries, not extracting tissue, bone, or genetic material of any kind. No DNA sample exists in any laboratory anywhere in the world, because no one has ever taken one. Any video claiming otherwise is not reporting science. It is generating fiction and dressing it up with the vocabulary of a real discovery. The funeral itself, staged by the new King James's court just weeks after her death, was a genuinely elaborate affair. Elizabeth's embalmed body lay in state at Richmond Palace for several days, allowing counselors, courtiers, and foreign dignitaries the opportunity to pay their respects before the procession moved to Westminster. James spent an estimated £11,000 on the funeral, an enormous sum for the period, and later commissioned the sculptors Nicholas Hilliard and John de Critz to design her tomb monument, a project that itself cost close to £1,500 more. The finished tomb featured a life-sized marble effigy of the Queen, and evidence recovered from a drawing discovered in Germany decades ago, dated to roughly 1618, shows that the effigy was originally painted in vivid color: an ermine-lined crimson robe, a colored dress, gilded lions at each corner, and lifelike flesh tones across the face, all of which have long since faded, leaving only the plain white marble visitors see in the Abbey today. A separate, far more intimate artifact survived the centuries alongside that formal monument: Elizabeth's actual funeral effigy, a wooden figure dressed in the Queen's own clothing and paraded during the funeral. Procession itself, a practice common to English royal funerals of the era. That original effigy, along with a corset believed to have been worn by the Queen and a ring closely associated with her, remains on public display today in Westminster Abbey's Queen's Diamond Jubilee galleries, offering visitors a physical connection to Elizabeth's actual body, and wardrobe considerably more genuine than anything a fabricated DNA claim could offer. Before any of that, though, the story of Elizabeth's own body and survival begins decades earlier, in a childhood defined by proximity to violent death long before she ever wore a crown. Elizabeth was only 2 years old when her mother, Anne Boleyn, was beheaded at the Tower of London in May of 1536 on charges of adultery and treason that most modern historians consider deeply questionable, evidence extracted through pressure and political convenience rather than genuine wrongdoing. Following her mother's execution, the infant Elizabeth was formally declared illegitimate, stripped of her title as princess, and quietly sidelined from court, reportedly asking her own governess with startling precocity how it was that she had been Lady Princess one day and merely Lady Elizabeth the next. That precarious status followed her directly into adulthood. In March of 1554, at 20 years old, Elizabeth was arrested on suspicion of involvement in a rebellion against her half-sister, Queen Mary I, and imprisoned inside the Tower of London, the same fortress where her own mother had been executed 18 years earlier. Contemporary. Accounts describe her crying out to onlookers as she entered that she never expected to come there as a prisoner. She spent 2 months confined, technically comfortable, but under what historians describe as immense psychological strain before eventually being released without sufficient evidence to convict her on May 19, 1554, precisely. 18 years to the day after her mother's execution on that exact same date. She would not become queen for another 4.5 years, but that specific stretch of imprisonment, standing directly in her mother's shadow inside the walls where Anne Boleyn had died, remained, according to historians who have studied her later writing and behavior, one of the defining traumas of her entire life. Now here's where the real story becomes genuinely worth your attention, because Elizabeth's actual physical history is thoroughly documented through contemporary letters, court records, and modern historical research, and it reads like something out of a medical thriller in its handwriting. In October of 1562, at 29 years old, Elizabeth fell violently ill at Hampton Court Palace with what her physicians initially mistook for an ordinary fever, requesting a bath in an attempt to feel better as her condition worsened. Within days, her condition deteriorated so severely that she lost the ability to speak entirely, and her own council began quietly preparing for her death and debating who might succeed her. A genuinely destabilizing crisis for a country with no confirmed heir and a recent history of violent succession disputes still fresh in living memory. The illness was smallpox, one of the most feared and lethal diseases of the era, killing roughly a third of everyone it infected. Nearly dying, dispatching official correspondence to foreign ambassadors as though the crisis had barely interrupted the ordinary business of ruling a kingdom. But that's not even the most disturbing part of what smallpox did to the people around her. Elizabeth herself recovered with relatively minor visible scarring, a detail multiple courtiers specifically remarked upon with barely 3 weeks after the Queen's own recovery, an ornate tomb still standing today in the village near Hampton Court, bearing a rhyming epitaph commemorating her sacrifice. Elizabeth lived. The women who saved her life paid for that survival with their own faces, and in Penn's case, with her life entirely. Now understand exactly how this single medical crisis reshaped the rest of Elizabeth's public image for the following 4 decades. Contrary to a popular modern myth claiming Elizabeth spent the rest of her life smothering disfiguring scars beneath thick white makeup, contemporary accounts from courtiers deliberate political tool, part of a carefully constructed visual mythology, presenting the Queen as an ageless, almost otherworldly figure whose beauty and authority existed outside the ordinary decay of mortal time. If you like and subscribe to this channel, this is exactly the kind of real, carefully documented history worth digging into. The places where the true story turns out to be stranger and more compelling than whatever fabricated version happens to be circulating online at the moment. That lid-based cosmetic, applied heavily and repeatedly across decades, carried a genuine and largely unrecognized medical cost of its own. Modern toxicologists studying the composition of Venetian ceruse have confirmed that prolonged use caused a documented range of symptoms among Renaissance-era women who relied on it, lead absorption directly through the skin. The preparation itself combined white lead carbonate with vinegar, producing a smooth, pale finish prized across European courts of the era, applied not just to the face but often across the neck, chest, and hands as well, meaning the surface area of exposed skin absorbing the toxin daily could be considerably larger than a modern reader might initially assume. Some historians studying the surviving descriptions of Elizabeth's final years, including her documented hair loss, deteriorating teeth, and periods of physical frailty inconsistent with simple aging, have specifically pointed to false-paternity, cumulative lead exposure, as a plausible contributing factor. Though consistent with the broader, honest uncertainty surrounding her death, no definitive modern toxicological confirmation exists, since doing so would require exactly the kind of physical sampling that has never actually been performed on her remains. Elizabeth applied this mixture consistently for decades, layering it increasingly thick as she aged, specifically to maintain the pale, unblemished mask her public image had come to depend upon, meaning the very substance designed to project eternal youthful authority may have been quietly poisoning her the entire time, a slow, self-inflicted, toxic exposure hidden behind one of history's most carefully managed royal images. That image itself reached its most elaborate expression late in her reign through paintings like the so-called rainbow portrait, completed around 1600, depicting an Elizabeth well into her 60s, rendered with the smooth, unlined face of a woman decades younger, surrounded by symbolic imagery of eternal spring and unbroken royal authority, a painted fiction specifically constructed to reassure a nation anxious about its aging, unmarried, childless queen, and the uncertain succession crisis her death would inevitably trigger. Now widen the picture beyond smallpox and cosmetics, because Elizabeth's medical history extended across her entire reign, documented extensively through the letters of ambassadors, physicians, and courtiers who observed her closely for decades. She suffered recurring severe headaches, documented bouts of what contemporary sources described as melancholy, and in her final months experienced a documented physical and mental decline that alarmed those closest to her, including refusing food, resisting medical treatment, and reportedly standing for extended periods rather than lying down, out of what several accounts suggest was a fear that lying down signaled surrender to death itself. Courtiers close to her in those final weeks described a woman who barely spoke, sat motionless for hours on cushions on the floor of her chamber, and reportedly refused to name her successor outright, even as her council pressed her with growing urgency, finally indicating her wishes only through a gesture rather than clear spoken words, according to some accounts of her final hours. She died on March 24, 1603, with her physicians at the time attributing her death broadly to the cumulative effects of age and declining health rather than any single identifiable disease. A conclusion. Modern historians studying the surviving records have generally found consistent with what limited medical documentation exists, without any confirmed single definitive cause ever being established. That absence of a confirmed single cause of death is precisely the kind of genuine historical uncertainty that makes Elizabeth's actual medical story so much more interesting than any fabricated DNA revelation could ever be. Historians have proposed several competing theories over the centuries, ranging from blood poisoning potentially connected to her decades of heavy lead-based cosmetic use, to pneumonia, to simple exhaustion and organ failure consistent with a woman in her late 60s who had spent months in visible physical and psychological decline. No definitive answer exists, and unlike the invented viral claims about hidden genetic secrets, that genuine uncertainty is openly acknowledged by legitimate historians rather than dressed up as a dramatic, unearned revelation. Now consider the other genuinely persistent historical mystery surrounding Elizabeth's body, one that has circulated in various forms for centuries and long predates any modern AI-generated content. Known popularly as the Bisley Boy legend, this local folktale claims that the real young Princess Elizabeth died of illness as a child while staying in the village of Bisley in Gloucestershire, sent there to escape an outbreak of plague, and that her terrified guardians, fearing brutal punishment from King Henry VIII for allowing his daughter to die under their care, secretly substituted a local boy roughly her age in her place, one who then grew up, disguised as a girl and eventually became the queen the world came to know. Proponents of the legend point to Elizabeth's famous reluctance to marry, her refusal to allow physicians close physical examination later in life, and her unusually commanding masculine style of leadership as circumstantial support for the theory. The legend has no credible historical evidence supporting it whatsoever, and professional historians have thoroughly rejected it as an entertaining piece of local folklore rather than a serious historical claim, particularly given the sheer number of people, physicians, ladies-in-waiting, and foreign ambassadors negotiating potential royal marriages who would have needed to maintain that deception across an entire 6-decade reign without a single verifiable leak, official record, or contemporary rumor from anyone genuinely close to the situation. That distinction matters enormously for understanding exactly how genuine historical mysteries differ from manufactured viral content. The Bisley Boy legend, however far-fetched, at least emerged organically from centuries-old English folklore, has been openly studied and explicitly debunked by professional historians using available evidence, and is presented honestly as legend rather than confirmed fact by anyone taking it seriously today. The current wave of AI-generated videos claiming scientists analyzed Elizabeth's actual DNA follows a completely different and considerably more troubling pattern, inventing a scientific procedure that never happened, attributing findings to unnamed researchers who do not exist, and packaging the entire fabrication using confident, authoritative-sounding narration specifically designed to be mistaken for genuine reporting rather than openly acknowledged as speculation or folklore. Now compare that fabricated approach against what legitimate modern researchers actually have studied regarding Elizabeth, because real, careful scientific work on her physical legacy does genuinely exist, just not in the form any viral video describes. Conservators and art historians at institutions including the National Portrait Gallery in London have spent years conducting detailed technical analysis of Elizabeth's surviving portraits, using infrared reflectography, pigment analysis, and X-ray imaging to study how her image was constructed and revised across dozens of paintings produced during and after her reign. That research has revealed fascinating details about deliberate artistic choices, the specific mineral pigment S used to achieve her famously pale complexion, painted over alterations made to earlier portraits, and the tightly controlled visual propaganda machinery the Elizabethan court built around presenting an eternally youthful, almost supernatural royal image, regardless of the Queen's actual advancing age. This is genuine, published, peer-reviewed scientific work, conducted by named researchers at real institutions, producing findings anyone can verify through museum records and academic publications, standing in stark contrast to invented DNA claims, traced back to nothing more than an anonymous script generator. Now understand why this particular pattern of fabrication has become so common across online video platforms recently. Content built around historical figures already carries built-in audience interest and search traffic, meaning a video falsely claiming scientific analysis of a beloved or fascinating historical figure can attract substantial viewership with minimal actual research or fact-checking required to produce it, often reusing the exact same narrative structure with only the monarch's name swapped out for a different historical figure entirely. AI text generation tools make producing convincing-sounding pseudo-scientific narration faster and cheaper than ever before, and this specific combination of a real, genuinely compelling historical figure wrapped in an invented modern scientific breakthrough has proven to be an unusually effective formula for generating clicks, regardless of whether a single claim inside the video holds up to even basic scrutiny. So what does the real, fully documented story of Elizabeth's body actually tell us once the fabricated DNA claims are set aside entirely? It tells us about a young queen who survived one of the deadliest diseases of her era, while the women who saved her life paid for that survival with disfigurement and death. It tells us about a carefully constructed public image built quite literally on top of a slow-acting poison, applied daily for decades in pursuit of an unchanging, ageless royal mask. It tells us about a death still genuinely unexplained by modern historical standards, openly acknowledged as uncertain by serious historians, rather than falsely resolved by invented laboratory findings. And it tells us about a centuries-old local legend, already debunked through honest historical inquiry long before any algorithm ever tried to manufacture a stranger, faster, and considerably less honest version of the same basic mystery. The real Elizabeth never needed an invented genetic secret to be one of the most compelling figures in English history. Her actual body, scarred by disease she survived while the women who saved her paid with disfigurement and death, slowly poisoned by the very cosmetics meant to erase every visible trace of that survival, and shaped from earliest childhood by watching her own mother's execution recast her overnight from princess to outcast, already tells a story. Stranger, sadder, and far better documented than anything a fabricated headline could invent on her behalf. The next time a video promises scientists finally analyzed a centuries-dead monarch's DNA and found something shocking hidden inside, remember that the real history sitting quietly in Westminster Abbey's sealed vault has been waiting patiently the entire time, fully documented, thoroughly studied by named historians using real evidence and requiring no invention at all.